My neighbor reported me to the HOA 9 times. Then walked into my backyard. Before I start this story, I want you to imagine something. You just moved into a new neighborhood. You're minding your own business. And then one neighbor reports you to the HOA. Not once. Not twice. But 9 different times. For things like your grass being half an inch too tall. Or your trash can being visible for 1 extra day. Or, this one was my personal favorite, my tomato planter violating neighborhood aesthetics. At that point I honestly thought this guy just hated me. But the weirdest part? The story doesn't end the way you think it does. Because the same neighbor who kept reporting me ended up completely changing my life. And it all started with a handful of dirt. So for context, I'm a 32-year-old guy who bought a townhouse about a year ago. Nothing fancy. Just a quiet suburban neighborhood where all the houses look similar and everyone does that polite little wave when you drive by. You know the one. Friendly. But distant. Except for one neighbor. Mark. Now Mark lives 2 houses down from me, and if you've ever met someone who takes HOA rules seriously, you know the type. Perfect lawn. Perfect hedges. Sidewalk edged so clean it looks like it was cut with a laser. Trash cans lined up like they're in a military parade. Meanwhile, I work in IT. Which means my schedule is chaos. Late nights. Random weekends. Emergency server problems at 2 a.m. So yeah. My yard wasn't exactly winning any awards. It wasn't terrible. But sometimes the grass got a little long. Apparently that was unacceptable. Because about 3 months after I moved in, I got my first HOA letter. The complaint said my grass exceeded the allowed height by half an inch. Half an inch. At first I laughed. I mowed the lawn and forgot about it. But a week later another letter showed up. This one said my flower beds had weeds. Then another about my trash can being visible from the street for too long. Then another. Then another. After the 6th letter, I started realizing something. Every report was coming from the same neighbor. And one afternoon I caught him. Mark was standing across the street. Taking pictures of my yard. Not even trying to hide it. Phone out like he was documenting a rare species of suburban grass. So I walked over and asked him what he was doing. He gave me this tight smile and said, just helping maintain neighborhood standards. Now at that point I wanted to argue. But honestly I was exhausted. So I just nodded and went back inside. But the letters kept coming. And then came the complaint that pushed me over the edge. Apparently my backyard tomato planter violated neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Yes. My tomatoes were apparently a threat to society. That night I sat on my back porch staring at that stupid planter box wondering if I had accidentally moved into the world's strictest neighborhood. And that's when something weird happened. Because Mark walked into my backyard. No knock. No warning. Just opened the side gate and walked straight in. At that point I stood up immediately. But before I could say anything, he walked over to my tomato planter. Knelt down. Grabbed a handful of dirt. And said something I did not expect. He looked up and said, "Your soil's wrong." I just stared at him. This was the same guy who had been reporting me nonstop. And now he was giving me gardening advice? So I asked him the obvious question. Why do you even care? He sighed. And then he said something that completely flipped the situation. Look. If I don't file the reports, someone else will. Apparently Mark used to be on the HOA board years ago. Which meant he knew exactly how the complaint system worked. He explained that certain neighbors loved filing violations. And if complaints came from them, the board could issue immediate fines. But if the report came from him, it triggered a warning period first. So basically, he'd been filing the reports himself. To stop someone else from escalating them. I was still processing that when I asked him something else. Why didn't you just talk to me first? Mark actually looked a little embarrassed. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, honestly? In my experience that usually goes badly. He explained that when he used to be on the HOA board, he tried talking to people directly all the time. And most of the time people got defensive. Or brushed it off. Or assumed they were being attacked. Warning letters usually get people to fix things faster, he said. Then he paused and added, but I'll admit I probably stressed you out more than I should have. I could have handled that better. That was the first moment I realized Mark wasn't the villain I thought he was. Then he pointed at my planter again. And also, he said, your tomatoes are never going to grow in that. Which, to be fair, was accurate. He grabbed the dirt again and explained that tomato plants hate compacted soil. Good tomato soil should be loose and well draining. Usually a mix of regular soil, compost, and something like peat moss or coconut coir. If water sits on top instead of soaking in, he said, the roots suffocate. Apparently I had basically created a brick. He also told me something else important. Tomatoes need 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight every day to produce fruit. Mine were barely getting 4. Before leaving he said, if you actually want those plants to survive, come see my yard tomorrow. The next day I walked over expecting a normal backyard. What I found looked like a small farm. Raised garden beds. Berry bushes. Herbs. Compost stations. The guy had built an entire backyard ecosystem. And honestly, it was impressive. He showed me how compost works, basically letting food scraps and yard waste break down into nutrient-rich soil. According to him, compost slowly releases nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium without burning plant roots. He also showed me something surprisingly practical. In HOA neighborhoods, organic slow-release fertilizers are usually approved because they don't smell and don't create runoff. He used a balanced fertilizer like 10-10-10 early in the season, then switched to lower nitrogen once tomatoes started flowering. Too much nitrogen makes tomato plants grow huge leaves but fewer fruits. I had never thought about fertilizer ratios before. He also taught me one trick that blew my mind. When planting tomatoes, you can bury part of the stem sideways underground. Tomato stems grow extra roots along the buried section, making the plant stronger and more drought resistant. Over the next few weeks we rebuilt my planter. Better soil. Better drainage. Proper spacing between plants. And slowly, my garden started improving. But here's the moment that surprised me the most. About 2 months later, Mark knocked on my door holding a basket. Inside were tomatoes. From my plants. Actual tomatoes. I'm not going to lie. I felt ridiculously proud. Mark smiled and said something I still think about. Gardening isn't really about plants. It's about patience. He explained that when he retired early, he struggled with feeling like he didn't have much purpose anymore. Gardening gave him something to build again. And teaching someone else made it even better. But something unexpected happened after that. Other neighbors started noticing the gardens. One couple asked how to start their own planter. Then another neighbor joined. Then another. A few months later, 5 houses on our street were growing vegetables. We started trading harvests. Tomatoes from my yard. Cucumbers from another. Herbs from someone else. And the funniest part? The HOA sent me another letter, but this time it said my landscaping improvements were enhancing the neighborhood aesthetic. Mark thought that was the funniest thing he'd heard all year. But about 6 months later, something changed. Mark stopped coming outside as much. At first I figured he was just busy. Then one day I ran into his daughter when she came to visit. That's when I found out Mark had been dealing with some serious health issues. The kind that make gardening a lot harder. And honestly, that hit the whole street harder than we expected. Because by that point Mark wasn't just the HOA guy. He was the reason half the neighborhood had gardens. So we started doing something simple. We kept the gardens going. And every week someone brought Mark a basket. Tomatoes. Peppers. Cucumbers. Herbs. Everything he had helped us learn to grow. Because the thing he started ended up bringing the whole neighborhood together. So yeah. My neighbor reported me to the HOA 9 times. And somehow that turned into a garden, a hobby, and a whole community. And honestly, if Mark hadn't annoyed me with those reports, I probably never would have met him. Never would have learned how to grow anything. And definitely never would have met my neighbors. Also, tomatoes are way harder to grow than the internet makes them look. We hoped you enjoyed this Britt-O-Verse story. Please like and subscribe for more fun and interesting content. See you soon.